I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die.
Boker Tov, everyone. It's time for Soulful Psalms once again, though, in point of fact, I am going to make this one a little different. Instead of focusing on the S sound, as in Psalm Soulful, I'm going to go for the silent P from the Greek, and I'm going to make it polemical psalms. Okay. My lame effort at alliteration. Anyway, this is going to be slightly more confrontational or debatable. Let's use the word debatable, because I'm going to talk about this one psalm and its Christian uses and why, from our perspective, they don't get it. So, hopefully you just saw the clip from Blade Runner, one of the great dying speeches in all of film. But great dying speeches go a long way back. People who are in the process of dying apparently are able to offer all kinds of powerful and poetical and moving and elusive things that just spring to their mind moments before they die. And in this case, in the case of Psalm 22, that's where we're going to start. So if you go to the very first phrase, the very first verse of Psalm, well, it's actually the second verse, because the first verse has a whole superscription, which we all now know about. This one's for the leader on Ayeleth HaShachar, a Psalm of David. All right. So whatever the heck that means, maybe something about your anger, upon your anger or something. Any case, we don't know for sure, as sometimes happens with ancient Hebrew. We cannot be certain about the meaning. But let's get to the actual phrase. It's Eli, Eli, lama asafthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Powerful opening line. And a powerful closing line, because according to the Gospels, this is what Jesus declares from the cross before he dies. A classic, I'm about to die, I'm going to say something profound speech. Now, at the risk of being cynical, and I'll say this about Jewish deathbed speeches also, as a clinician, as a former clinician, someone who used to work with dying people all the time, dying people rarely ever say anything profound. Most of them, their brain functions and their speech centers have shut down long before they actually cease to be. Death is a process, not an event, unless you're like crushed by something. And so death speeches, not so much. I've heard a few, but nothing like this. So anyway, aside from the cynicism about someone quoting scripture in their dying moments, I want to call attention to this because Psalm 22 plays a very, very significant role in Christological, that is, the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible through the eyes of this must be about Christ. All right. And Christians love Psalm 22. It's a very long psalm. And so I'm just going to call your attention to some of the interesting things going on and what's controversial between Jews and Christians about this particular psalm. Now, as I said, it's a very long psalm. I'm not going to try and read it all to you. But in effect, if I were to give a summary, it is about an individual who is enduring protracted suffering and in many places describes in vivid terms what they're going through. So at one moment it says, I can see all my bones, meaning that they're starving to death. Another place, I am a worm. I am no longer a human being. So it is an incredibly powerful, agitated declaration of individual suffering. Now, what has happened in Christian tradition is rather than just say, oh, Jesus, he picked an appropriate verse to quote at the time of his suffering, Christian interpretation has declared that he's pointing us to Psalm 22 and telling us that this is a psalm specifically dedicated to the fate of Jesus on the cross. And so that's how it's read in Christian tradition, even though it goes through incredible number of different metaphors, similes, ways of describing suffering. I mean, it says virtually everything except I feel like I am roadkill. They didn't have roadkill back then. But in any case, it's a poignant psalm and it's a powerful psalm. But Christians have specified it in a way that they interpret it to be entirely about Jesus. And suffice to say, it's a good psalm when you're feeling terrible and you want a melancholy thing to recite, much like we love to listen to the existential misery of Pink Floyd when we're feeling miserable. You know, a sad song when we're sad actually helps us. And so this is a good psalm for anyone who feels like they're burdened, suffering, the world is coming after them. But I just want to call attention to two elements that are used in Christian interpretation and try and help you understand what's going on. So the first one is the issue of what came first, the psalm or the event described. So in the story of Jesus, one of the prominent stories that is told is the story of how the soldiers who crucify him then play lots in order to decide who gets his external clothing. You know, clothing actually was an expensive item in the ancient world. You couldn't just go down to Walmart. So a good intact piece of clothing, even if it was used, is very valuable. And so according to this, the Roman soldiers threw lots or dice in order to decide who was going to get Jesus's garment. All right. And so according to the Christian reading of Psalm 22, that is prophesied right here in verse 19. They divide my clothes among them, casting lots for my garments. All right. As I've just explained, people will claim dead people's clothing all the time. I would think, for example, to the incident in A Christmas Carol, where the ghost of Christmas future takes Ebenezer Scrooge to his future, and he sees his own death. And what he also sees are the people basically pillaging his clothing and taking it for their own benefit. Because, again, even as late as the Industrial Revolution, good quality clothing was worth hanging on to. You just didn't throw it away, or you just didn't give it to, goodwill. You used it yourself. And they go through his clothing and they take what they want. Same thing going on here. And this would have gone on in the ancient world no matter where it was. It wasn't just happening to Jesus, it happened to everyone. But what the Gospels try to do is to say, see, these Romans gambled for his clothing, and that was predicted by the psalm. Now, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that the psalm contains this passage. They divide their clothes among themselves, casting lots for my garments. And then someone told a story or constructed an episode in the death of Jesus that would mirror this, so that it seemed like this had been predicted. This is not unusual in the Christian Bible. There's actually a more innocuous term for this. It's not just trying to stage something. It's called typology, that stories will be told about Jesus that mirror things already said in the Hebrew Bible. Why does Jesus end up resurrecting someone? Well, the prophet Elijah resurrected someone. So Jesus can't be any less powerful than a Hebrew prophet, so he has to resurrect someone. Moses parts the Red Sea, Jesus walks on it. God provides manna in the heaven. From heaven, Jesus creates loaves and fishes for a multitude. Each one of these stories is meant to connect the life of Jesus back to familiar stories and images in the Hebrew Bible. And this is another example, is that when a reader who is familiar with the Hebrew Bible hears the story of how his garments were divvied up, they'll think of Psalm 22. But now Christians treat it as a prophecy. So that you know, so that you understand how this dynamic works. It's a literary motif, and I don't know that it's meant to deceive, but it is certainly confusing for people. All right, but I'm going to go up 2 verses before that, verse 17. Now, this is a critical point of debate between Christians and Jews. There are a few texts where we definitely get into a kerfuffle about what they mean. One of them, of course, is Isaiah 14:7. Yeah, 14:7. No, 7:14. Let me get 7:14, which is about the idea that a virgin gives birth. Jews will say, well, in the Hebrew, it absolutely does not say virgin. We have a word for virgin in Hebrew, and that word there, alma, is not virgin. It means a teenager, it means an adolescent, it means a young girl. It doesn't say anything about her sexual status. Whereas Christians read that as a virgin and make it a miracle, which is, I don't think, what the prophet intended. That's a classic example of this kind of polemical debate. And this is another one. And in 17, it reads, as Jews translate it, dogs surround me, a pack of evil one closes in on me, like lions, they maul my hands and feet. Okay. That is a slightly telegraphic translation, in that the word they mauls, or the verb they mauling, is not there. But we're familiar with this motif of wild animals eating our extremities. It appears multiple times elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. So for a Hebrew reader, there's no problem with this. We understand exactly what the author is saying, that wild animals are feeding on my extremities, right? However, Christians insist that the word that appears as ka'ari, like a lion, is actually krari, which means pierce. And therefore, their translation of this is they pierce my hands and my feet, right? So an explicit reference to the crucifixion. And for Christians, this is an incredibly compelling proof text. there was no evidence that the Hebrews, the Israelites, the early Jews crucified anybody. So that would make no sense in its own time. It only makes sense if it's a prophecy. But that requires you to break down the word in a different way than the Hebrew reader would break it down. So for us, it's got a comparative, ka, like, ari, a lion, and they read it as a single word, karar, which is to pierce something. All right. It's debatable. I'm not going to say you can't read it that way, but I would say from context, from what we know about other rhetoric of suffering that we see in the Hebrew Bible, it's really referring to being attacked by wild beasts, dragging you around and pulling your limbs off. All right, just be aware that this could be debatable, but we're pretty clear on what we think it means, but they're pretty clear on what they think it means. So for them, Psalm 22 represents the tribulation, the suffering, the word we no longer really understand anymore, the passion of Jesus, right? Because the passion comes from this idea that passion represents pain, suffering, heightened emotion. And so when we say the passion of Jesus, Christians go, oh, yeah, he suffered. And everyone else is going, really? Doesn't that mean he got kind of excited? The word has changed in its meaning. So just be aware that Psalm 22 for Christians is a full expression of Jesus' suffering. Whereas we understand it very differently. It's a generic declaration of human suffering. It applies to anyone, not to a specific person. And certainly it's not prophetic. It's meant to simply speak to a universal experience. Now, let's get off of the polemics for a little bit and just take one line that I really like. It's fascinating what the rabbis did with this line. So the way it's translated here, Ata Kadosh Yoshev Tehilot Yisrael. But you, the Holy One, enthroned, comma, the praise of Israel. So it's a title. And I think that's really what the original composer meant. You are the Holy One who is enthroned, the praise of Israel. The rabbis, being very clever interpreters of the Bible, note that if you have a couple of words beside each other, you could stick an of in between them. Smichut is what it's called in Hebrew. And until modern Hebrew, until Mishneh Hebrew, there was no actual particle or word that conveyed of. You simply knew that in a certain string of words that you should say of. So Melech Yisrael, King Israel, should properly be translated into English as King of Israel, even though there is no of there. So the smichut for early Hebrew. Remember, early Hebrew is early in the development of language. So a lot of the particles, the accents, the things that we use today, the apparatus to make written sentences easily comprehensible hadn't yet been invented. I'm sorry, we're not that clever. So the of was yet to be innovated in Hebrew. It exists now and has for about 2,000 years. It's shell. Shell means of, but not in biblical Hebrew. So instead of reading this as you are the Holy One, comma, enthroned, comma, the praise of Israel, the rabbis interpreted this as, but you are the Holy One enthroned of the praise of Israel. In other words, God is enthroned because we enthrone him. and that in fact God is elevated to the exalted status that God is because he has a people. And that's a little weird. I mean, isn't God God under all circumstances? Well, yes, but if there's no one showing honor and respect to God, what does it matter? If God's just sitting up in the heavens counting atoms, who cares? It's the fact that we are engaged with God, that he is the God of the Jewish people, that makes God truly relevant, and we take it seriously. And the rabbis want us to understand that as much as we need God, in a sense, God needs us. And that this is an important idea of where we sit in the cosmic system, that we play a role in making God real on earth through our righteousness, through our charity, through our actions. People see God in the world because we make God visible. God is enthroned upon the praises of Israel. So, on that thought, on that note that you really matter. You matter to the world, you matter to God. I'm going to stop there. So enjoy the polemics if you're into polemics, but also appreciate some of the unusual messaging that's happening throughout this particular psalm. And if you're really miserable, instead of playing Dark Side of the Moon, you can read this psalm. Take care, everyone, until next week.